It's time for Drummer Nation. Welcome to Drummer Nation, the show where drummers talk drums. If you make music by hitting something, this is the place for you. This is your host, Michael Vosbon. On the show, I interview professional drummers who are artists, educators, manufacturers, and media. To be a part of it, please subscribe on YouTube, Facebook, or your favorite podcatcher, and I'll make sure you never miss a thing. Hello and welcome again to Drummer Nation. I'm very excited about this show because it's about cymbals, and as many of you know, I'm a cymbal guy. With some partners, some great partners, I had a company that managed phosphorus cymbals for many years before starting our own brand, Crescent Cymbals, which we later sold to the great company Sabian, who is making many of them available as we speak. This show I'm particularly excited because I have a legend in the cymbal industry as my guest, Colin Schofield. Colin Schofield worked with the Zildjian Company for more than 2 decades. So he goes way back and has some great stories about the people he worked with there, the company, the history of the cymbals, all kinds of terrific stuff. And he also got to know very well some of the great artists that were associated with that company, principally Tony Williams. He is presently active with Tony's widow, Colleen, to make available a tribute set of cymbals designed from Tony's original famous cymbals he played in the Miles Davis band in the late 60s. Legendary cymbals, I must say. He has some great stories. He's very articulate, and it always sounds great coming from him with that proper British accent. So, my friend Colin Schofield, coming up with a great interview about cymbals right after word from our sponsors. The former Crescent Vanguard series are now widely available as part of the legendary Sabian HH models. HH cymbals are traditionally hand-hammered into shape and sound by Sabian craftsmen. Each cymbal receives between 2,000 and 4,000 hammer blows, resulting in increased musicality, tone complexity, and unmatched sonic texture favored by drummers in the know for generations. Find out more about the Vanguard series and all other Sabian models at Sabian.com. Musician, designer, and award-winning innovator Ron Dennett relentlessly pursues quality of sound. Every Dennett classic drum is crafted completely by hand, carefully assembled one at a time, and personally signed by Ron himself. The shell weights are tuned for optimal performance, giving each one inherent resonance, full-range dynamics, and a pure, rich tone. All Dennett classic snare drums feature soft, contoured beds that are deep cut to eliminate snare buzz and accommodate the use of wider 42-strand snares. Compare a Dennett with others in its class, and you'll discover that the alternative is compromise. Colin Schofield, welcome to Drummer Nation, and thank you so much for doing my show. How are you?
Doing very well here this afternoon. Thanks very much for inviting me to come on the show.
Well, you're an industry legend, and I want to go back to the very beginning. You're obviously from the UK, right?
Yes, absolutely. I born and bred in London, England, and started playing the drums there. Played my way through college playing the drums, etc., and was very lucky to get my first job, working in the industry, in the drum industry.
And was that with Premier?
That was with Premier, though I hesitate to classify that as a job. It was more of an internship, but it was a foot in the door, and from that position. They were the distributors for Zildjian in the United Kingdom at that time, and I got to know the Zildjian people through that relationship, and they had just opened an international representative office in London around that time. We're looking for someone to come in and take over their artist relations activity in the UK, and I'm very happy to say that was me all those years ago.
Well, so that's the Zildjian connection. I know you were with Zildjian for two decades, right?
Yes, absolutely. I began working for them in London, and that was right at the time. Well, fairly soon after the split had occurred, and so they were looking to have a bigger presence in Europe. Though the major competitor at that time was the Paiste company, and pretty much all the drummers in England and most of Europe around that time. So many of them were playing Paiste cymbals. So they kind of brought me in to establish Zildjian back with a lot of the musicians and drummers there in Europe. So I did that for about a year, very successfully, and then they opened up an office on the West Coast in Los Angeles. Actually, again, to sort of combat what Paiste were doing, all the film studios and TV studios. That was MTV was ruling the world at that time, and so they opened an office in Los Angeles and actually transferred me from London to go and work in the Los Angeles office. And I worked there for about a year, and then moved to Boston to the head office, and eventually 20 years later was vice president of marketing worldwide.
Now the break you mentioned, for those who may not know, some of the younger viewers, was when part of the Zildjian family split into Sabian and Zildjian. Is that the break you referred to?
Yes, indeed. Yes, there was when Avidus Zildjian, who really developed the company in the United States in the early 1900s. Certainly a true legend of the cymbal business. He had two sons, Armand and Robert, and when Avidus passed away, very common situation if you've ever studied anything with regards to family businesses. But that's usually the least successful when you have two brothers in the next generation. It's very rare that the younger brother wants to work for the older brother, and that was kind of the situation with Zildjian, and Robert and Armand separated, and Armand carried on running the Zildjian company, and Robert went and took over the factory in Canada and started the Sabian company.
It's good background information for a lot of people. Both great companies, obviously. You work mostly with Armand?
I'm sorry, say that again?
Did you work mostly with Armand?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Now, what comes to mind is that great picture of Armand sitting on a bench with some legends. I mean, there's Roy Haynes in there, and Elvin, and I think Erskine, and Louis Bellson, and you know the photo I'm talking about, right?
Yes, that was the American Drummers Achievement Awards. So that was Armand sitting with Elvin and Louis Bellson and Max Roach and Roy Haynes, and those were his buddies. I mean,
I'll try to put a little shot of that in the video. But the thing I was going to say, that this was not the old square white dude president of the company hanging out for a perfunctory picture. Those guys really respected Armand. He hung with them.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Armand as a young teenager would go and see Chick Webb. I mean, he had that history. He knew all of them. He would go and see Chick Webb. He knew Cozy Cole. He knew Papa Joe Jones. And would help them, choose their cymbals. And obviously, was extremely close friends with Buddy Rich. They had a great respect for each other. So no, I mean, Armand, sitting next to Max Roach and Louis Bellson, I mean, they go back years together. So it was always like old friends getting together, and they deeply respected Armand's knowledge, and they respected his love for the music. I think that's the most important thing. Armand could be, very serious businessman and get down to, brass tacks and do what needed to do. But, he loved music. I mean, he just loved music. He was an accomplished piano player. His favorite instrument was the trumpet. He was very close friends, adored Maynard Ferguson. And was played the drums very well as well. He was left-handed. He had one hell of a ride beat from testing all those cymbals since he was a little kid. So and I think that's what the musicians always could see with Armand is his love for the music, his that passion. You couldn't hide that, and that's why Buddy loved him, because Armand's favorite music in all the world was big band jazz music. So for Armand to go and see Buddy Rich with the big band, with the horns blaring, and Buddy tearing it up, that was heaven for Armand. That was just, joy for him. And that joy would come out. And, it was a big deal when Buddy would come to town. That was a big deal. I used to drive, Armand and his wife, and Lenny and his wife. It was always a big deal. I would be the designated driver. Take them in to go and see Buddy, and those were great times. It was just tremendous fun. And Maynard too. Whenever Maynard came to town, that was a big deal. But Armand just adored Maynard, loved that style of power trumpet playing.
Well, I got to hang with him a little bit as a young man. Maynard would come maybe to Atlanta where I was. Peter Erskine was on the band, and you just end up as a hanger-on. And Armand was just a bigger than life personality. You couldn't be around him and not really dig him, and it's a force that's missed. What a great guy.
Absolutely, one of a kind. Never met anybody like him before or since.
Right.
And we shouldn't forget Lenny DiMuzio. Lenny was part and parcel of the dynamic duo of we always talk about Armand and Lenny, and again, Lenny was the same way. Loved drummers, loved music, loved to hang out, loved to talk drums. Always wanted to be with the drummers, and he too had tremendous respect for Buddy Rich. Buddy was literally a god to them. He was the king of the drummers, the king of the drum business, and they loved him. And as I say, whenever he came to town, that was a really, really special time. And I'm very fortunate to have been able to take them numerous times to go and see him. And I would sit very quietly in the back of the bus, hoping that Buddy wouldn't notice me. Let Armand and Lenny hang out and have a good time.
Well, let's talk about Lenny for a second. He was another beloved figure that was a friend, I'm happy to say, of mine, and so many people in the industry.
Lenny began, I think, in the early 60s with Armand. That was really around the time, after the Beatles exploded in the U.S. market. All the percussion companies, all the drum companies, Ludwig, expanded, and Zildjian too. They actually couldn't make cymbals and drums fast enough, and that's when Armand was looking for help in the factory and to have someone to come in, and Lenny originally started as a cymbal tester, and was testing cymbals, and began working with the artists, and Lenny had Lenny was many things. But he had an incredible ear, Lenny DiMuzio. I mean, let me tell you, in terms of picking cymbals and matching cymbals, which is an art form unto itself. Lenny was the master. I mean, absolutely the master in terms of picking cymbals, blending cymbals. He had an incredible ear, and Lenny was a superb musician himself. I used to go and watch him play often. He was a wonderful drummer and singer. He was invariably would be doing the singing as well whilst playing the drums.
I didn't know he was a singer. I have to tell a joke on Lenny. There's a story, perhaps you know it. Buddy was visiting the factory and he had some cymbals laid out, and Buddy would play them and say higher, higher, and Lenny was raising the stand.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
That's comical, I know, because Buddy loved him too. Okay, so let's skip ahead. Because I know you. I want you to tell me the Tony Williams story, the Tony Williams cymbal, and how it's now available. And you were the main force that made that work. Can you tell us how that came to be?
Yes. Well, I would certainly I would say first of all that it was actually Tony's wife, Colleen, that was the real driving force behind it. I was just privileged to be able to offer my assistance and help to her on the side of the industry contacts and on the development of the cymbals. Tony, growing up for me, Tony was my, great hero, great inspiration, in terms of playing the drums. And obviously, Tony, had a long relationship with the Zildjian company, and that's where I got to work with him. Initially was at Zildjian, and very fortunate to be able to say, I felt I became, very good friends with him. We had similar sense of humor. A lot of people don't realize this about Tony, but he was an incredibly funny man. He had a great sense of humor, and he was a great Monty Python fanatic. So, as am I. So we hit it off immediately. So invariably the phone would ring, and I'd pick up the phone, and it'd be Tony, on the end of the phone, and he would just start reciting a Monty Python sketch. At which point I'd join in. So we got on very, very well, and worked together. I took him, did many clinics with him, and spent a lot of time with Tony, and had some very deep conversations with him. Very few of which were about drums or music. Yes, he could be very just floor you with some of his insights about the instrument and about music, but he was extremely well read, and we would talk about politics, we would talk about Cirque du Soleil, we would talk about great art, we would talk about architecture. I mean, he was just the complete package, as it were. And
a genius to boot. Let's not forget.
And a true genius.
Yes.
That word is thrown around, much too lightly nowadays. But he was a true genius, and he also had the genius's impatience with the whole idea of doing something again. Tony. Let's face it, he reinvented an art form, and pretty much exhausted its possibilities, and then moved on and did it again, in another style of drumming, and he was always about moving forwards, and some people, he could get prickly at times, as I'm sure you've heard, but that was usually sort of came from that impatience, as it were, in terms of people getting fixated and fetishizing over certain things, and that would he was always trying to guide people to themselves and to look to the future. I know one of my favorite stories was one of the drum clinics. When Tony used to tune his drums to specific notes, he'd have a note pipe that he would tune the drums to specific notes. And during the clinic, someone asked him, well, what can you tell me what notes you tune your drums to? And Tony said, I'm not going to tell you. I said that those are my notes. Find your notes. And so people could take that the wrong way. But if you actually listen to what he was saying, the point that he was trying to make is, don't try and be me. If you're going to be successful, you be you. And that was something that he was always trying to communicate, and also trying to communicate, don't just become fixated on drums and fixated on the ride cymbal and what size it is and how it was made and whether it was hand. It was like you've got to understand the world in order for it to come out in your musicianship, and he.
I think all these personality traits. I'm sorry, I don't talk you. I think all these personality traits you're discussing lend themselves to why he was such a great foil for Miles Davis.
Absolutely, you can't distinguish the two. You have to live life to let it come out through your instrument.
Amen. So tell me now about Colin and the Tony. These are Tony's cymbals from the '60s,
yes,
right?
Yes.
With Miles.
So the genesis of that story, needless to say, Tony's passing was such a shock. It was just such a terrible tragedy, and and it truly was a tragedy. And he and Colleen, had not been married that long. And it was really, I felt with Tony had really found peace for the first time. There's no question he and Colleen were soulmates, and to see them together and to see how happy he was just an absolute joy. So obviously it took a long period of mourning for her, before she could even entertain any thoughts of doing some sort of tribute project. And I have to tell you, she wasn't short of offers. There was 100 companies that were offering her significant money to stick Tony's name on this product or that product. She wasn't interested in doing something that didn't have integrity and it wouldn't have the kind of honesty and credibility that Tony would have wanted. So we did, over a fairly long period of time, we did talk about developing a tribute product, and we talked about the idea, given my background in the industry, about doing some sort of tribute cymbal. And so I actually went out to visit with her and to look at Tony's cymbal collection, and went through. He had flight cases. A lot of cymbal cases, a lot of different cymbals, and there was one bag of cymbals that was not in a flight case with all the others. They were completely separate from all the rest of them, and I remember saying to Colleen, well, what are these ones? And she said, well, these are the original set that he played on the Miles Davis Quintet recordings, and he used to keep them separate from all his other cymbals. They had so much sentimental value to him because they were given to him by Max Roach. Max was his great friend and mentor when Tony first moved to New York. Playing with Jackie McLean, he stayed with Max. He lived with Max for a long time. And it was Max that took him down to the Gretsch factory, and it was Max who gave him this particular set of cymbals, which dated back to the 50s, and Tony used them on all the quintet recordings right up until I think till the Sorcerer recording, by which time the ride cymbal had kind of been given life to create some great music.
Let me interject with a question here. Those were Turkish handmade cymbals?
Yes. Those were at that time there was still the Turkish K Zildjian cymbals that were being made still in Turkey at that time. I say we estimate they were made sometime in the 50s. Those ones, and in the early 60s they were being distributed by the Gretsch company. So I think those stories are quite well known of people going down to the Gretsch factory and picking their drums, and at the same time they would be picking up those Turkish cymbals. So that there's a lot of reasons why the bebop drummers at that time were using those cymbals. I mean, yes, one obviously was to do with the sound. That darker, trashier sound really sort of lent itself to the that small group bebop style and post-bop drumming that was going on. But at the same time, a lot of those guys were playing Gretsch, and they could get their hands on those old Turkish cymbals as well. And then a lot of them began playing the US made Zildjians. As the music developed and got louder, etc. The US cymbals became more and more popular, and then eventually the US Zildjians. They took over the trademark for the K Zildjian as well. That's a long story that we could take up several interviews going into the details of that. But yes, that's where those cymbals were made, and that's very important because that really was the decision that was made to have them made by the Istanbul Mehmet company. In terms of wanting to do something that was authentic and wanting to do something that really had integrity and credibility to it. Colin wanted to kind of seek out the company that made those cymbals originally, or the closest thing to it. And that was when we talked to a couple of the different Turkish companies, but when we talked to Istanbul Mehmet and Mr. Mehmet himself, who was working in the factory at that time as a young man when the original cymbals were made, it became kind of apparent very quickly that really to do this authentically and have them made in a manner that was closest to how the original ones were made, that would be the best route to go, and that was really what drove the decision. And it was quite we went over to the factory in November of 2014. Colin and I flew over with Tony's cymbal set, and which we there was no way that Colin was going to ship them or trust them to a courier or anything like that. So we hand carried them over there to bring them to the factory, to give them a chance to look at them, to measure them, to play them, and to recreate something as close to the originals as possible. And it was interesting because Mr. Mehmet recognized the cup shapes. The cup shapes are actually different from anything that Istanbul Mehmet was currently making. And I remember when he came up and he was looking at the cymbals, and it's kind of like a light bulb went off, and he disappeared down into the bowels of the factory, with a couple of the guys, and was like kind of digging through all the old machinery, etc., and actually found those original cut dies from from the 50s or whenever it was. They'd actually changed the machine, so they had to kind of jerry rig the new machine to get the old cut dies to fit it. But then I think they ended up having brand new cut dies made based on those original ones. But that was quite a special moment when you saw Mr. Mehmet recognize them and think, I have them somewhere. And sure enough, about 30 minutes later, they reappeared with these old antique really cut dies that they found, and that's what was used for the recreation cymbals.
Well, you're bringing back great memories to me. I have many trips to Istanbul, and I know most of those guys, and I've watched them make the cymbals there. So I imagine that was a wonderful experience for you.
Well, it was in terms of the contrast. Having obviously worked at Zildjian, for 20 years, and become obviously familiar with the Zildjian style of manufacture, and then seeing the style of manufacture. It's very different, very, very different.
It's very primitive.
I'm not saying, I want to make it very clear, I'm not saying that I think one's better than the other. I don't. They're just different, because Zildjian are making some absolutely incredible, breathtaking cymbals. They always have and continue today. They make some superb, unbelievable stuff. And
they actually do, I very much so. I had a couple of cymbal companies, and I always made that point. You can't disparage anybody's cymbals. You're going to tell somebody Steve Gadd doesn't sound great because he's playing Zildjian? Of course not. He sounds fantastic. Same thing with Paiste, same thing with Meinl. What the customer's looking for is choices, and those were a different sound palette than was currently available. And I've heard those cymbals. The results are fantastic. How's the response been?
Tremendous, and it really was. That they were they took it very, very, very seriously, and Colin and I took it very, very seriously. And Colin has a extremely good ear, and I was taken aback. She's very musical. She knows more about jazz than I do. She's extremely knowledgeable and very well informed and very much in tune Tony's creativity, and she was, she was relentless. We went through several prototypes and several go-arounds, and she, A, being the cymbals, after we left, they were shipping the prototypes to us, no, she rejected numerous prototypes before we got something that both she and I felt were good enough to the originals in terms of capturing their sound.
That's a great story. I'm glad you were involved in that. It gives drummers a choice. They can have that sound from Tony from the 60s. They can have modern day sounds. They can have all kinds of stuff from all kinds of great companies out there. And that means the music wins, I think. So you tell me what you're doing now.
Well, I'm still still helping Colleen with the project. It is ongoing. Originally the way that it was launched was we did 250 sets, and there's a very real, because of the way that they make them, there's a very real limitation on the number of cymbals that they can make. They're very labor intensive, and it's, they have those standard prototypes that they have to match for all the cymbals. So those original 250 sets, they were they were sort of pre-sold. They sold out immediately. And they are going to start making them available individually now. They are going to be available on the market individually, and that's one other thing that I should mention, because it was something that Colleen always would stress to me. It was very important to her to create that whole set. Again, Tony's ride cymbal from that era is the subject of thousands upon thousands of drummer conversations. That cymbal that he used, the 4 or more 7 steps to heaven cymbal, is the one that we all covet.
It's the Holy Grail, man.
Absolutely. But what Colleen wanted to make very clear, and this was because what was very important to Tony, is that part of the reason that ride cymbal sounded so great, was the other cymbals. It was part of a set. Tony had an orchestral view, an orchestral kind of sonic vision, and the hi-hats and the crash was all part of it to him. And actually, when it got to the point where he really couldn't use the ride cymbal longer, just because it had had a lot of holes drilled into it to stop cracks, and it just got to the point where, frankly, it still sounded great, but it was kind of reached the point of potential complete deterioration. He stopped using it, and he retired the whole set at the same time. He stopped using the crash and the hi-hats and moved to Miles's music was getting a little bit more, rock orientated. He was starting to experiment with rock rhythms, as was Tony, and I think he, then chose different cymbals moving on from that. But that was one thing that was very important that we tried to communicate to everyone, and that's why we wanted them available as sets to begin with, because we didn't want people just to focus on the cymbal. Because it's a beautiful crash cymbal, and the hi-hats are some of the most fabulous sounding hi-hats you'll ever hear in your life. The original set is probably the most beautiful set of 14-inch old dark Turkish cymbals I've ever heard. Just beautifully nested and played in, the sweetest thing you could ever hear. So that was very important, in terms of Tony's vision was have the whole set of cymbals, and that's why they were originally launched that way.
Well, I've had a chance to play some of them at the trade shows and at dealers, and they're just outstanding. They're just wonderful. If anybody's wondering if you guys got it right, you got it right, man. You nailed it. And if you're interested in that sound, that's the place to look. Now, I notice you have behind you the poster over your left shoulder.
Yeah, that's one of the box sets that we were involved in, creating the artwork for that. And say Colleen, has been involved in every aspect of the sort of marketing of the cymbals too. She has a background as a script writer, so she's an extremely good writer. So she wrote a lot of the text and for the brochure and for the marketing. And we're actually working on a brand new ad as well for this kind of next phase of the cymbals being made available individually. So that's in the works. We should be seeing that.
Well, it's all first class. I know anything you have something to do with would be such. I also see over your right shoulder the album cover for Tony's album Believe It, which is one of my favorite albums ever.
Yes, well, that one, Tony actually, that's a signed one. Tony actually signed and wrote a message on that one to me. So that's one of my most treasured possessions. I think it says to Colin, my friend and buddy, love Tony Williams. So that's encased in museum quality glass. And is a great treasure, and I miss him. I miss him every day. He'd always mimic my English accents, as say he'd always say Colin, and I miss picking up the phone and hearing his voice. I really do. He was in addition to being a genius, true genius, he was just super sweet person, great guy, and I loved him to death, literally. And
well, I never had the chance to meet him. I heard him many times, and we all miss the fact that we can't go hear him play, and we can't find new recordings with him. But man, these are great stories that are worth telling and worth hearing, and I really appreciate you taking the time to do that with us. It's a pretty short format show, so I'm going to have to ask you to do another one sometime, would you please?
Oh, I would love to. I say we have many stories. I was fortunate, during my career to get to see a lot of great music and I meet a lot of great drummers and a lot of stories that should be recorded for prosperity, as it were.
Well, let's try to do that, and I really enjoy hearing from the people in the industry side of things as well as the artist. It's a hand in glove kind of relationship that should be explored further.
And I think there's some tremendous music being. I think we're in another golden age as far as I'm concerned. There's some fabulous music being made today, and some fabulous young drummers. There's really so much talent out there. I think it's, as they say, if to know where you're going, you've got to know where you've been. And enjoy sharing those stories. Being able to work as long as I did with Elvin Jones and some of the things that Max Roach, kind of taught me from the way he acted about life. These guys were they were heavy cats. Elvin and Max and those guys, and we can learn a lot from them, not only about music but about life too. And I'm always,
I think they're American treasures, American originals, American treasures. When you say, what does this country give to the world? We gave them these artists. This is profound music that's as heavy as anything that's ever been written. And I'm thrilled as you are, I know, to be just a part of the industry and to actually know these people and hear them play.
Absolutely, it's a great great privilege. It really has been and continues to be. Anytime you want to do this again, I'm only too happy to relay the stories that I'm able to relate. So.
Well, thank you so much. The beat goes on, so there'll always be new stories and new drummers, but these old stories are terrific too. So let's catch up again sometime soon, and thank you so much for doing the show, Colin.
Thanks very much, Michael. Anytime.
host, Mark Lavospine, and I want to thank our friends at Atlantic Pro Percussion, Gannett Classic Drums, Sabian Cymbals, and Classic Drummer Magazine. We'll see you again in 2 weeks.